bringing you the latest in tax credit news, insight, and analysis. This is Tax Credit Tuesday with your host, Michael Novogradac.
Hello, I'm Michael Novogradac, and this is Tax Credit Tuesday. This is the November 12th, 2024 edition. This podcast is a special edition. It's our election edition. For months, we've discussed on this podcast the possible outcomes of the November 5th general election. And more importantly, what each of the possible outcomes might mean for various community development tax incentives. We've discussed the consequences of one party sweeping the presidency, House, and Senate, as well as the potential for divided government. Well, now we know the outcome of most of the critical races, which means we can begin narrowing our analysis. Now, if you're watching on YouTube, you can see that we have Peter Lawrence today joining me on the podcast to discuss the election results and what those results mean for community development and renewable energy. Peter is Novogradac's Director of Public Policy and Government Relations, and no one is more plugged into federal affordable housing, community development, historic preservation, and clean energy policy than Peter is. We're very fortunate at Novogradac to have Peter on our team. Now, Peter has been diligently preparing materials for a Novogradac webinar on the election results and what those results mean for tax policy over the coming months into next year. Now, that webinar is scheduled for next Tuesday, November 19th at 2:30 p.m. Eastern, 11:30 a.m. Pacific. Now, Peter and I will be the duo that bring you that webinar. Now, I asked Peter to join me today to preview the webinar and share some of what he is preparing for next week. All of his analysis isn't done yet, but he'll be able to share some of what he's pulled together so far. Now, as you undoubtedly know, Donald Trump was elected president last week. He's returning to office 4 years after losing his reelection campaign to Joe Biden. Now, Trump did win all 7 of the so-called swing states and is also projected to win the popular vote. He'll take office in January, and he will have a Republican Senate majority. It's currently looking like a majority of 53 to 47. Now, most commentators also expect that Trump will have a slim, potentially very slim, Republican majority in the House of Representatives. Now, I say that, but I will note not all the races in the House have been called, and Democrats do have a slim possibility of regaining the majority. As of the recording of this podcast, Republicans held 214 of the 218 seats that they need to retain the majority. That means they need to win 4 more seats to get to the majority. And there are currently 18 uncalled races, with Republicans leading in 8 of them. So everyone expects there will be a Republican sweep, which means that when Donald Trump takes the office in DC as president, he will have a Republican House and a Republican Senate. And we will operate on that assumption throughout this podcast. And should the Democratic Party thread the needle, take control of the House, we'll have another election podcast. But as I note, that's a pretty remote event. I think the betting markets give it about a 2 or 3 or 4% chance of happening. So there's a lot more I could say about the impact of the election results. But rather than go through all of that, I'd rather jump into the Q&A with Peter. We have so much to discuss here. So if you're ready, let's get started. Peter, welcome back to Tax Credit Tuesday.
It's good to be back, Mike. I really always appreciate the opportunity to come on, and also really looking forward to that webinar where we'll go over a lot of this content in much greater detail.
No, I certainly enjoy working with you on pulling the webinar materials together. The PDF in and of itself will be a great resource for the community development and clean energy community as they think about the impact of the election results on tax policy next year. Now, this is your 17th appearance on the podcast, and it's the 3rd time you've appeared to discuss the outcomes of a national election and the repercussions for community development tax incentives. And as I noted, we're still working on the information. You're doing more work than I am. That we're going to share on the webinar next week. But I appreciate you joining me here today to give us a bit of a preview and for you to share some of your initial analysis. But before we dive into some of today's topics, please share with our listeners and viewers a little bit more about what you do at Novogradac.
Thanks, Mike. So I'm, as you pointed out, Director of Public Policy and Government Relations. So I cover all of the firm's practice areas and how they intersect with the federal government, both with Congress and the relevant federal agencies, which is a lot of work. But I also, beyond that relational work between Congress and administration, I do also am available to work on various policy related engagements. And so if you're interested in reaching out to, if you've got a particular public policy program where we can help, please reach out. We're more than happy to engage you in any work like that.
Great. Thank you for that, Peter. And most of our audience knows also that you spent a lot of energy with our various working groups. And I'd encourage listeners and those viewers to consider joining one or more of the Novogradac working groups. Also, Peter, I think I speak for a lot of people when I say thank you for the role you play with those working groups and others, keep them connected to what's happening in Washington, D.C. Not only do I thank you for the role you have played, let me thank you in advance for the role that you will be playing over the next 8 to 14 months.
It's going to be a very, very busy 8 to 13 months for tax policy, and looking forward to working with all our working groups on that.
And there is a reason why we said 8 to 13 months. That wasn't just somewhat random. There's a very focused thinking behind that. But Peter, when I think of the effect of the election results on community development and energy tax policy, I break my analysis into sort of two parts. There's the impact of the election results and the potential for a lame duck year-end tax bill, as well as the impact of the election results on a major tax bill that we're all expecting over the next 8 to 13 or 14 months. And that legislation over the next 8 to 13 or 14 months is going to address many of the expiring tax provisions in the 2017 Trump tax bill. Now, with that in mind, let's start with the first half. Share with our viewers and our audience your take on the chances of there being year-end tax legislation. And that would be tax legislation that deals with a lame duck Congress, the current Congress, not those that have gotten elected to the Congress that will take office next year.
Right. And just to remind folks, we still do have President Biden until January 20th next year, as well as a Democratic majority in the Senate. But they are essentially lame ducks, and their power is slowly ebbing. We know that a lot of big priority for the lame duck for Democrats and Senate is confirming judges, but when it comes to year-end tax legislation, I would note a couple of things. One is there is, of course, the need to make sure the federal government keeps operating. There's a continuing resolution that is in effect until December 20th. So what we're hearing early, but I'm continuing to research more, and we'll talk about more in the webinar, is a potential second continuing resolution, which would take federal government funding from December 20th into March of next year, and enable the new Congress and the new leadership in the Senate to help rewrite those spending bills. More immediately, there's also tremendous focus on disaster legislation. As many listeners know, this past fall, we've had quite a few major disasters, Hurricane Helene and Hurricane Milton, among others. And there's been several disasters of major import going back as far as fires in Maui as well. So there's a pent-up demand for major disaster recovery legislation. And that you start with a spending component. It typically means money for FEMA, money for the Small Business Administration for their disaster loans. And in terms of HUD, there's the Community Development Block Grant disaster grants. We all expect that to be the foundation of a disaster legislation. But there is also potential for disaster tax relief, starting with one component of the Wyden-Smith bill we've talked a lot so much over this past year, Mike, that was introduced by Representative Greg Steube from Florida, And that's a sort of foundation that could make the possibility of a tax bill. And beyond that, there is the potential for a go zone like package added, most likely probably in the Senate. And just as a reminder, what history is, the go zone tax legislation that was enacted in the wake of Hurricane Katrina provided $1.7 billion of disaster low-income tax credits, $1 billion of new markets tax credit allocation authority, and an increased percentage from 20 to 26% for historic tax credit properties in the disaster zone. And some of these are all potential ideas. It's not certainly a guarantee by any stretch of the imagination. But as recently as the last time we had a lame duck in December of 2020, Congress passed $1.2 billion, $1.25 billion dollars in disaster low-income housing tax credit authority to address a wide variety of disasters. And so it's not inconceivable that Congress would do so in this lame duck as well.
And if there is a tax bill, we're always talking about with various tax provisions, you need a train to ride on. So if there is this disaster tax bill, we may or may not get additional community development tax incentive funding. But there's also this bill that's sitting over in the Senate that we've talked about on this podcast in the past that would provide additional local tax credits and lower the 50% finance by test. And that's the Tax Relief for American Families and Workers Act. And that's actually the bill that, as you noted, has the tax relief, has this disaster tax provision that they'd be pulling out of to create this separate piece. What are the chances that we could also see the low-income tax credit and 50% finance by test riding on this tax bill?
Well, I know many in the affordable housing community are going to do all their level best to try to include that along with any other tax legislation in lame duck. But I will say from where it looks right now, it does seem like a bit of a long shot. I think the sort of temperature I see in Congress is focused on doing disaster as a immediate short term and deferring other tax issues to the big Super Bowl tax in 2025. And for whatever reason, those broader low-income housing tax credit provisions, the ones to increase the 9% allocations and to lower the productivity bond financing threshold, is viewed as a longer term issue that's not must pass this lame duck. Much as I hope it's not the case and hope we still do have a chance, I would say that it doesn't appear likely from where I sit right now.
Certainly one thing I'll be looking for is to see if the repeal or the accelerated expiration of the employee retention tax credit that was included in that bill, and that was serving as a revenue raiser. If the repeal of that, because I didn't see anyone lobbying for it not to be repealed. So I am curious to see if it ends up getting repealed. And I say repealed, but it really was just going to accelerate the expiration deadline in terms of when claims could be filed. So I'll be curious to see if that ends up making its way in or if it just ends up dying on the vine. Okay, let's move now to what you referred to as the Super Bowl of tax next year. And I know you're quoting members of Congress. Let's move on to the next session of Congress. It starts January 3rd. But before we get into the specifics of tax legislation next year and the Super Bowl tax, really quickly, and we can go into this in more detail with slides and all the rest showing the different members and going into a little bit more granularity. But if you could quickly share with our audience what we know now with the likely leadership of the two tax writing committees in Congress, namely the Senate Finance Committee and the House Ways and Means Committee.
Sure. And as you point out, Mike, we're going to get into much more detail in the webinar. So if you're interested, please, we certainly encourage you to register to get that further detail. But just quickly, in the Senate, of course, we have a new change party in power with the Republicans taking the Senate. And that means that Senator Mike Crapo from Idaho will go from being the ranking member to the chair. And then similarly, the current chair, Senator Ron Wyden from Oregon, will go from being chair to ranking member. And also, there were quite a few Democrats on the Finance Committee that were up for election this cycle. Several of them did retire, and a few lost their re-election races. All the Republicans returned on the committee, but they will have vacancies. Given their virtue of the majority, they will have seats added to the committee. Although the committee size and ratio are things that are still yet to be determined and negotiated in the coming weeks. And so we'll certainly, again, this is part of what I'm researching for our webinar coming up, and we'll have much greater detail along those lines during then. For the Ways and Means Committee.
Before we switch off Senate Finance, am I remembering correctly that due to not running for reelection, resignation, or losing reelection, is it 6 vacancies? Or
Yes.
then 6 senators on Senate Finance Committee are not coming back.
Correct.
So
Three
that-
and one resigned mid session, and 2 lost their races.
depending on the committee ratios, you would think either those 6 would get, there'd be 6 new Democrats added, or maybe 5 new Democrats are added, depending upon how the committee ratios go.
Right. And it could be as low as 3 or 4, depending if they reduce the size of the committee and increase the ratios. So it's like a 2-seat majority rather than 1-seat majority.
Okay. Please, thanks for letting me interrupt you. On the Ways and Means Committee.
So the Ways and Means Committee, there's much less change. We still will have Jason Smith to be chair. He will be entering his sort of 3rd year as chair, and the Republicans have a 6-year term limit as chair. So he's still got plenty of time there. Richie Neal from Massachusetts will continue to be the ranking member. And there were 2 Democrats, 2 Republicans, 4 total members that are retiring on the committee. And as of right now, all members appear to be likely to be reelected. There's one sort of member that's still potential of losing her seat, but it doesn't look like likely that they all return. And again, depending on committee size and ratio, assuming that doesn't change, there'll be at least 4 new members of the committee will be working with on that Super Bowl tax.
Excellent. Thank you for that. And then before we go into specifics of tax legislation next year, I talked a lot about how confident we are that there will be a major tax bill next year. As I have noted already in the course of the podcast, a large number of the Trump era tax cut, or the 2017 tax cut provisions, expire at the end of 2025. A large portion of them are applied to individuals. Some can be indirectly business related, but there'd be a large increase in tax on individuals if it wasn't extended. And maybe share with the audience roughly what the estimate is, how many taxpayers would see a tax increase in 2026 if there wasn't a major tax bill to extend some or all of those TCJA tax cuts.
Yes, according to a tax foundation analysis, as much as 62% of taxpayers would experience a tax increase in 2026, which would start to be reflected in your most employees' paychecks starting in January 2026 if Congress does not act. And I think the Republican majority would never want to risk that scenario. And given that it is entirely now their control, as with the control of the House, Senate, and White House, there would be able to blame. I couldn't blame the Democrats for not acting. And plus, I would just also say that reconciliation doesn't come by all the time. And it's just too good of an opportunity, even how difficult sometimes it is to get all the details done and the 2-step part of the process, which we'll talk about more in a moment. There are plenty of pitfalls and challenges, but it's given the fact that it provides an opportunity for the party to write partisan legislation. It's just too good of an opportunity to pass up. I really do think that we're very likely to see that next year.
I agree 100%. And just level set for the audience, when we're talking about budget reconciliation, some of you might be thinking, well, what are the chances that the House and the Senate and the White House can get on all the same page? And how do you avoid a filibuster in the Senate? Because if you have 53 Republicans and you need 60 votes to stop a filibuster. Well, that's what the budget reconciliation is all about. If you pass this budget reconciliation bill, then you can pass the legislation on with only 50 votes, 50 plus the vice president. So you don't need to have the 60 vote threshold. And that's why this process goes on. And then I will also note that the willingness of either party to have a partisan tax bill is very bipartisan. The 2017 tax legislation passed under budget reconciliation, and the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022 passed under budget reconciliation. One's partisan Republican bill, one was a partisan Democratic bill. So this budget reconciliation isn't necessarily easy, and that's something you have to do at the beginning part of next year. The other thing I want to say a bit about with respect to having a partisan tax bill is having a partisan tax bill isn't necessarily easy. When the Democratic Party controlled the House and the Senate back in 2021, they tried to do a partisan tax bill. They failed in 2021 and then came back with the Inflation Reduction Act in 2022. So it's definitely not easy depending upon your majorities. And in the Democratic Party, it was the Senate majority that wasn't sufficient to overcome some objections from a couple of senators. In the Senate, this time around for Republicans, being 53 to 47 seems like a good majority of 3 seats to get something through. On the House, it could be the Republicans only have 218 seats. They have or a 221, and they have the same nominally 3 votes majority that the Senate has, and 3 out of 221 is a lot more narrow than 3 out of 53. So the whole concept of getting all the Republicans on the same page will definitely be an effort, and there's going to be a lot of work needed. But I'm of the belief, and I think Peter is as well, that ultimately it may take a while. So I don't know if it could be done by next July or August, or it could take all the way till December. It's hard for me to imagine it slipping over into 2026 and letting withholding rates go up and all the rest. It's also, but that is a possibility. I don't want to say that's not in the realm of possibility, just as they've had government shutdowns in the past and it takes a while. Some pain has to get felt before you come together. You need to feel the heat to see the light, if you will. But that's the thinking there. And it's hard to imagine it collapses and they try to do something on a bipartisan basis. And then, Peter, we can talk more about the details of budget reconciliation next week on the webinar. I'd rather swing now into looking at the various areas that all of our clients are working and get your thoughts on this. And there's so many places to go here, and we're already well into this podcast. So let me just, not rapid fire, but somewhat rapid fire. Let's start with opportunity zones. Opportunity zones are scheduled. The deferral opportunity is scheduled to end at the end of 2026. And without any renewals or extensions, they would essentially expire. What's your take on opportunity zones?
Well, I think the Republican sweep was very much an optimistic scenario for opportunity zones legislation. President Trump made opportunity zones a big priority. He cited on the campaign trail as something he thought was one of the best parts of his 2017 tax legislation. So I feel pretty confident that we'll certainly get an extension and some sort of robust renewal of the incentive going forward, included in the legislation. I do want to mention, and I've somewhat correct the misperception that opportunity zones is somehow completely partisan. It had very bipartisan roots going forward, and the legislation that introduced it in the House was co-sponsored by by Richie Neal of Massachusetts, the ranking member. And there's plenty of other prominent Democrats who supported creating opportunity zones. And Senator Cory Booker is still actively supporting the incentive in the Senate. While despite that, it is to a large extent a big Republican priority, and therefore I'm fairly confident that there will be not just an extension, but some sort of robust of the incentive.
No, I agree as well. And I'd also noted, as I know you recall, Senator, just an example, Senator Cortez Masto of Nevada, Democratic member of the Senate Finance Committee, expressed her support for opportunity zones in the course of my Senate testimony at the end of July. She did want some modifications, but that's to be expected as any of these sort of tax incentives.
And the senator's going to be coming to our upcoming housing conference in Las Vegas next month. So we're certainly looking forward to working with her.
Yeah, no, we're excited that she could join us at the conference and provide a keynote. And all these different areas, Peter and I go into more detail on the webinar, but there's not time doesn't permit us to go into all the detail on each of these various sort of provisions. So this is very high level in terms of what we're going to talk about here on these various more targeted areas. In terms of renewable energy tax credits, there's a lot of talk on the campaign trail by President Trump, and he was against many of the provisions in the Inflation Reduction Act. Now that he's been elected president and Republicans are going to control the House and the Senate in all likelihood, where do you think we stand with those clean energy tax incentives continuing as they were originally enacted as part of the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022?
Well, certainly they're much more vulnerable than opportunity zones. And I will say this, however, that it's not a completely bleak picture. I'll just note that 18 House Republicans did write the House leadership all saying that the Congress should not take a sledgehammer to the Inflation Reduction Act, but more of a scalpel. And I would imagine that I think it's much more likely that there will be a scalpel approach as opposed to a sledgehammer. And I think the investments that the Inflation Reduction Act have triggered have actually happened in a lot of Republican districts. And I don't think the House Republicans will jump at wanting to eliminate that investment in their home districts. And so there will be elements of the legislation very much at risk. But I do believe the renewable energy community is going to put up a robust defense, and we'll see what ends up happening when the rubber hits the road.
No, I totally agree with that in terms of, I should think of it as being more on the margins as opposed to anything wholesale. But obviously margins matter, and it'll be important for the broader renewable and clean energy community to be very active in advocating on behalf of the incentives that they most support.
If you don't get for it, then you're at risk. You're potentially on the menu.
So quickly, new market tax credit set to expire after the upcoming combined $10 billion 2024-25 allocation round. Quick thoughts on that?
I think there's a very good chance that the new markets credit will be extended or potentially made permanent next year. It's got strong bipartisan support. And I think may not necessarily happen in reconciliation. It could be happening in another piece of tax legislation. But I definitely think it's proven itself over what will be its 25th year in operation. And I think the feeling amongst many members of Congress is that it's passed its tests and deserves to be made an indefinite part of the tax code. But we'll see. Again, we got to advocate for it. It's not going to happen in a vacuum.
No, I'm glad that you mentioned the potential for 2 tax bills next year. The whole concept of the sidecar bill, I want to go into more depth, and we can do that on the webinar. So I want to get your thoughts on the potential for that, which is an indirect segue into affordable housing. We've seen a lot of legislation introduced in the House and the Senate dealing with affordable rental housing, most notably the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act, pieces of that making its way in the bill that's sitting in the Senate that I mentioned earlier. And affordable housing has never gotten as much attention in an election than I've ever seen in my 40 years of practicing in this area. So with all that attention, what's your thought in terms of affordable housing provisions making its way into the Super Bowl tax?
Yeah, I think there's a good chance of them being included. I think it's just worth noting that the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act does have over 270 co-sponsors. That's the most bipartisan support of any tax bill in the entire Congress. And that's a very impressive threshold. And while it is true that a number of those co-sponsors are not going to be returning to Congress next year, we'll still have more than 218. That's for sure. And that's really a great base to build upon. And I do think that support is not going unnoticed in the congressional leadership. And I feel like there's the chances. It's not a guarantee. And again, we got to advocate for it. But I definitely think there are good chances that will be included either, again, in reconciliation or in a sidecar text.
Yeah, I did mention earlier that back in 2017, the makeup of the committees was such that we were very much on defense for a lot of these sort of community development incentives. So I do feel good about the fact that this time we're more on off. We have the ability to be more on offense than defense, which is a huge change. And hopefully I'm like by pausing my voice is PTSD is hitting me. And that was never more relevant than the next topic I wanted to ask you about, and that's the historic tax credit. Viewers, our audience may remember that back in 2017, the House bill repealed the historic tax credit, and thanks to the efforts of Senator Cassidy on the Senate Finance Committee, along with others on the committee, the credit was returned, albeit claiming over 5 years instead of one. What's your take on the historic tax credit and how it might be enhanced in the course of the tax bill?
Yeah, I think there's potential for us to go back to a 1-year credit. I think a lot of folks have seen the impact of going to a 5-year credit. And there's been, I think your testimony in the Senate Finance Committee this past July talked about how one of the ways you can help restore the value of the credit is to go back to a 1-year credit. And there are other provisions of the Historic Tax Credit Growth and Opportunity Act that potentially may be considered in tax legislation next year. And your comment, Mike, I think about the changes from 2017 to now, prompted me to just note that we do have a very different House leadership now as we did back in 2017. Former House Speaker Paul Ryan and former House Ways and Means Committee Chair Kevin Brady are very different from the current House Speaker Mike Johnson and the current House Ways and Means Committee Chair Jason Smith. Jason Smith has been a long time supporter of the community development tax incentives, was a co-sponsor, led on the Rural Jobs Act, which would provide new markets authority to rural areas. So we have a very different House leadership, and that makes the environment much, much better for the community development tax credits.
No, here. I'm really looking forward to the webinar just a week from the 12th. So on November 19th, Tuesday, November 19th, as I mentioned earlier. And I look forward to chatting with you about the potential for new tax incentives that could be enacted. I know we've talked before about the workforce housing tax credit, the neighborhood homes tax credit. There's the potential for an affordable housing tax loss provision that could be marketed to individual taxpayers to raise capital to renovate and preserve affordable housing. And some of these I mentioned in my Washington Wire this month, the month of November, and then the Washington Wire in December. We'll talk a little bit more about the election result and the impact. I'm also looking forward next week to talking to you about the extension of a variety of the other Tax Cut and Jobs Act cuts. One question that I got at our renewable energy conference was the likelihood of the expensing of personal property in land improvements. They were more focused on personal property, or housing more focused on including the land improvements as well. And that's something that not just renewable energy folks care about, the affordable housing folks care about, because that can add a couple of cents in terms of equity pricing. There's also the corporate tax rate. I look forward to getting your thoughts about the corporate tax rate. Is it likely to remain the same, be raised or lower? We all know the impact that had back in 2017. And there's so many other things I'm looking forward to talking with you about. I'm looking forward to going through what some of the offsets could be. What are the sources of tax revenue in a Republican drafted bill, as well as what are some of the costs of all the other provisions that President-elect Donald Trump talked about in the course of the campaign, from taxes on tips being eliminated to the SALT deduction and the rest. So there's so much more for us to be chatting about. And I'm looking forward to getting your thoughts, lay the groundwork for strategizing for community development, tax incentives, faring well in the course of the tax discussions. With all of that, maybe I'll give it to you if there's anything else you wanted to say before we bring this to a close and get back together again next Tuesday.
Yeah, I just want to reiterate something that we always say at our Watch Report panels and our conferences. There's nothing more important than making sure you continue to advocate for the community development incentive that you care most about with your member of Congress. And one of the best ways to do that is to actually invite them to visit your property or your business that you helped invest in the district. So many times members may know about development, but don't realize that it was largely financed with a community development tax incentive. And I've yet to see a member of Congress, once they actually go and tour a business or tour a property that was financed, that doesn't move to being much more of a supporter of the incentive. So really want to encourage any of you who are listening or thinking about inviting a member to visit the businesses and properties you helped finance. We are more than happy to help you in that. Please reach out to us to help you with that advocacy. It's really important.
Great. Thank you for that, Peter. And before we get to the off mic section, I wanted to remind the audience to please share this podcast with your colleagues who might also be interested. This is an episode that might be particularly useful across the various tax incentives to get a sense as to what this election means for these various areas in which we all work. I'd also like to encourage you to leave a review of the podcast on your platform of choice and remind you that we do have a full archive of episodes of the podcast available on our website at novoco.com. We also have a large archive of episodes on YouTube on our YouTube channel. With that, let's turn to our off mic section. As regular listeners know, we use this time to give a shout out to someone working within the various tax incentives where Novogradac is focused. Peter, who would you like to give a shout out to today?
Well, as you know, Mike, last week we had our Opportunity Zone Summit, and it was very successful. People were very excited about the election, getting ready, wanting to help shape the future of the Opportunity Zone incentive. And I just wanted to, as one of our leading policy partners in the Opportunity Zone community, the Economic Innovation Group. They're one of the indisputable leaders on the Opportunity Zone incentive, and we work very closely with EIG on the various Opportunity Zone policies we're trying to advocate in advance. In particular, I want to shout out to your panelist on your Watch Report panel at the summit, Catherine Lyons. She's a great person to work with. She's been really well plugged in with Congress, and we work very closely with her on advancing all the various Opportunity Zone incentives. So that's my shout out for this podcast.
Well, thank you. I'll echo your shout out to Catherine Lyons. She did join me on the opening Washington report session on Wednesday morning. And it was very bold of her, as well as we had a representative from the Senate Finance Committee and from the Ways and Means Committee, for all of them to be willing to join me on a Wednesday morning when the election was Tuesday night. It was very bold of them to join. So I appreciate all of them. And I certainly appreciate all the great work Catherine Lyons and Economic Innovation Group does on behalf of advocating for distressed communities, with Opportunity Zones obviously being a key part of that. And thank you, Peter, for being on the podcast today. I'm looking forward to the webinar.
As am I.
Yes, it'll be quite enjoyable. And to our audience, I'm Michael Novogradac. Thanks for listening.
This weekly podcast has been brought to you by Novogradac and Company, LLP. Archived podcasts are available online at www.novoco.com/podcast or by subscribing to the Tax Credit Tuesday podcast in iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, and Radio Public. You can find related links referenced in this podcast on our website at www.novoco.com/podcast. Novogradac and Company LLP is a national certified public accounting and consulting firm with offices nationwide. Learn more about our professional services at www.novoco.com.